Miniatures has always been handcrafted art. Most of it is still done by hand, which I think makes the miniatures more valuable as art, because everybody interprets their art a little differently. My sister had been living in Seattle, and she had been collecting miniatures, and I'd never seen miniatures before. But when she moved back to Albuquerque with her husband, and she brought her collection with her, and one day we were over at her house, and she's showing me her miniatures, and I thought they were okay, but I thought it could be done better. And she said, well, if you can do better, why don't you make some pieces? So I agreed to do that, and I made a couple of pieces, a plate and a goblet, and also a little jug. And she took those pieces to show in Chicago, and there was quite a bit of interest. That was in 1979, and that's when I started making miniatures. The way I choose pieces is I have a lot of silver books, and I look through the books, and I'll find pieces that are appealing to me. And then I'll take the picture and I'll scale it down to the 1/12 scale, and I'll try to make it as accurate as I can. But I take dimensions from the photographs, and I blow up one photograph so I can see the detail better, and then I reduce the photograph to the actual size of the miniature, so I can tell how thick the handles are going to be and the legs, and it gives me a better idea of how I can make that piece look real or accurate in miniature. I draw a line drawing, and the line drawing doesn't have to be accurate, because when I'm working on the piece, I'm actually going to be looking at the actual photograph. But the purpose of this line drawing is to be able to measure all the dimensions that I'm going to need to make this piece, and have them easy to look at while I'm working on the piece. Actually, I started in junior high school. I started taking wood shop and metal shop, and my dad was a furniture maker. I started helping him in the wood shop. We used to make custom furniture, and my dad did a lot of carving, and I learned to carve there too. And one piece he did that I still have is a door. It took him 6 weeks of carving to carve this door, and now that door is mounted on the entrance to my home, and I proudly display it. I think my dad did excellent work. The design was conquistador with swords crossed, and actually the conquistador looks a little bit like my dad, which is kind of a plus for me. This is the model of the lid that I made on the lathe, and it's made out of brass. It doesn't really matter what the lid's made out of. I use different metals. I use brass or tin or silver, because all we're looking for is the shape to make a mold out of it. Now that I've got the shape of the lid the way I want it, I'm going to do this little acorn on top, a little finial with kind of a crisscross pattern to make it look like the acorn finial that is on the original piece. Okay, I got the lines pretty much cut. Now I'm going to go over it with a polishing wheel just to kind of smooth it out. Okay, now we'll cut it off. Now it's got that rough edge from sawing, and the lid should be hollowed out. So now I'll take a burr and I'll work it. I'll start in the middle and then work to the edges. All right, now we'll put the sprue on this. Flatten out this piece of brass rod to make a sprue. Kind of grind it into the shape of the edge of the lid. Hold the sprue. That's it. That's the lid for the kettle. Now I just will clean it up a little bit, and then it'll be ready to make a mold of. A friend of mine came to me and asked if I wanted to get involved in this jewelry business. He said the Indian jewelry was going to be really big, and so he started buying raw turquoise and polishing it ourselves, and then we'd take it to the Pueblo and have it mounted by Indian silversmiths into jewelry. And I would sit down with the silversmith when I was off work, and I'd help him. And that's how I started learning how to make the jewelry. And so I learned how to make models, and I learned the soldering and the finishing and casting and the whole operation just from people I hired mostly. Already got the mold made, and that's done by using a liquid mold material and pouring it into a mold frame that holds the model. This is what the mold looks like after it's cured. It's a clear rubber, and it's a clear liquid when it starts. And there's a mold frame that has two glass plates on the sides that are held together with clamps. And you put this your model in. There's a cone-shaped piece that holds your model, and that you can see on this end of it. If that way, when they go to inject the wax, the wax machine has the injector matches the shape of this. It's a cone shaped also, and it fits right in here. To cut the mold, we use a scalpel that is a hook shaped, and that's used because when you cut a mold, you want the mold to have what we call locks, and that's what I'm doing now. Okay, and then you've got all these little like peaks and valleys in your mold, so when you put it together, it'll fit the same way every time. And now it's ready to inject wax into it. After I take the mold to the casting shop, they use the molds to make the molds for the silver. What's going on?
Hi. This handle here looks
We
like
begin the process by pulling the molds for a customer's order, putting those molds in rotation, and we like to have between 10 and 20 molds per rotation so the wax has ample time to cool. Those molds are injected in an automatic injection machine where the pressure is set properly and the timing is set properly. Once the last mold has been injected, the first mold should be cool enough to pull the wax. We clean those waxes with naphtha, and naphtha removes any mold release, whether it is a powder or a liquid mold release. That naphtha removes all of the mold release, and any bubbles or flash that comes from the waxes, those are all cleaned off to make sure that that wax is absolutely perfect. If the wax is not perfect, those imperfections are going to show up in the silver. Then we put them on what is called a tree. It is a wax tree. And those pieces are put on that tree with a hot wax point as close as they can be to make the tree hold as many pieces as we can without touching, because if those pieces are touching in the wax, they're going to touch in the silver, and then they are no good.
And they're attached at an angle, so when the silver flows into them, it flows smoothly and doesn't create turbulence, and it just makes a better casting. After they build this tree, and they'll weigh it, and then they deduct the weight of the rubber base, and this way they know exactly how much silver it's going to take to fill the mold. They take the tree, and it's still held up by the rubber base, and they'll slip a stainless steel cylinder over the rubber base, and it seals on the rubber base. They call these cans.
The next process is the investment process, which is done under vacuum. And investment is for layman's terms, it is a specially made plaster of Paris. It is poured into these cans. It sets up for 24 hours. Then it is put into what we call a burnout oven, which is similar to a ceramic kiln that heats up very slowly until it reaches a temperature of 1050. It's held at 1050 for probably 8 or 9 hours.
This will burn all the wax out and burn the carbon out of the mold and leave the mold clean without cracking it. If they heat it too quickly, the mold will crack and the casting won't come out.
It is then pulled out of the oven and put into an automatic casting machine and comes up to temperature.
They'll weigh the silver in a little cup and then pour it into the flask on the casting machine. And the casting machine has a melting device in it that melts the silver.
And it is cast at that temperature until all of the silver has melted. At that point, it is set out to cool. It is pulled from the casting machine and set out to cool. It cools for 10 or 15 minutes. Then it goes into what is called a breakout tank.
And the mold material will boil out most of it, and then they can clean the rest of it off with water under pressure, and they'll clean all the mold material off, and all that's left is the tree made out of silver now. It'll look exactly the same as the wax tree that they built originally.
It is then ready to proceed with clipping those pieces off of the trees and is shipped to the customer at that point. And the customer then does his own finishing.
One thing that has helped us improve miniatures is the technology. The equipment keeps getting better, and for example, the people are using laser to cut wood and make a lot more delicate wood products than they could before. I'm using the new technologies to make more delicate looking silver and more consistent. And then there's still a lot of handwork in it. So it's a combination of both. And the level of the miniature quality keeps going up. And it's spread all over the world. There's museums all over. And I have things in museums in several countries, in South Africa and France and England and Germany, Japan, all over. Okay, this is the model of the lid that I made on the lathe, and it's made out of brass. And this is the actual casting of that same lid, and it's made out of silver. They should be identical, and they appear to be identical, and as far as I know, they're identical. This is the casting of the kettle and the casting of the lid. And as you can see, the lid fits perfectly on the kettle because the model was made for it to fit perfectly. And I'll work these pieces, I'll polish them up with the sprues on, and then cut the sprues off, and then the lid will be able to sit all the way down. I leave the sprues on while I'm working on these because it makes it a lot easier to hold. And what I do is I'll use a pin vise, and I'll put the sprue in the pin vise and then tighten it in, and that makes it easy to hold on to while I'm working on it. This one I will also, it's got an engraving on the side, but I put it in the casting because it makes an easy guide to go over it by hand with the graver. And this is what I use to go over it with. You just follow the lines and deepen the details so it's a nice, sharp, crisp looking engraving when it's all finished. and